133, Section 4. It's called Foreign Policy After the Cold War. Now, at the end of the Cold War, marked by the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991, this actually led to a redirection of our goals and policies. So from 46 to 91, we were in a state of war with the Soviet Union. It was still a state of war. We just weren't actually fighting giant battles and blowing each other's cities up, thankfully. But in 91, it came to an end. And it largely came to an end because of the policies that you're going to see in just a moment. I had to get another Star Wars reference in because just how cool is this? This was in textbooks in American public schools in the mid-1980s. They saw this as the future. What is the future? Well, satellites with lasers shooting down missiles, a global defense network that we were going to build, and it would, in theory, end a need for war, or at least eliminate the possibility of global destruction. Watch Superman 4 for better reference there. Now, as the Cold War was coming to an end, Reagan's aggressive defense policies were actually paying off. When he doubled our Defense Department's budget and he announced that we were going to build the Star Wars program, the Soviets had no choice but to believe him. I mean, their spies were reporting, hey, the Defense Department's budget has doubled. Hey, they're actually trying to build this thing. He really believes he is going to build a global defense network, rendering our ICBMs obsolete. If we don't have first strike capabilities, but they do, it's the end game. We can't win this ultimately. Our only recourse, according to the Soviets, was to build a better version, was to also double their Defense Department's budget, was to also strengthen their conventional forces while at the same time somehow overpowering this new strategy. Well, guess what? It stressed the American economy to almost a breaking point to double our Defense Department's budget. It stressed the Soviet economy to its breaking point. We were playing a very dangerous, very expensive game of chicken. And we won. They swerved first. We essentially collapsed their economy. And so Mikhail Gorbachev, the last premier of the Soviet Union, began to announce policies that would end the Cold War. Two major things that you need to know. Number one, glasnost, freedom of the press. He's like, okay, so what kind of beef do the Americans have with us? Well, number one, that they're calling us an evil empire because we don't allow our people to criticize them. We have a secret police that goes and arrests people for anything and everything. We should probably stop doing that if we want to be friends with the United States. So, freedom of the press. It's a big one. So their version of the First Amendment. Secondly, perestroika. Perestroika. The allowing of some free private enterprise in taking steps toward democracy. Again, the allowing of some free private enterprise in taking steps toward democracy. That's big. That's really big. And I remember this well. In fact, when Gorbachev announced perestroika, what that meant was he was going to allow free elections in the Soviet satellite states. Places like Poland and Czechoslovakia, Ukraine, Bulgaria, Lithuania, these places that had been conquered by the Soviets back in the Second World War were now going to be free. And all of this, of course, was because the Soviet Union was on the verge of collapse. They couldn't afford to pay for this Cold War anymore. And they needed better relations with the United States to cut their military spending. Otherwise, their economy was going to collapse. And they were going to have another uprising. Well, it worked. These policies did lead to better relations with the United States. In fact, it did lead to the INF Treaty, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. Ergo, we stopped pointing bombs at each other. So here is, in 1987, President Reagan speaking at the Berlin Wall. In fact, at this speech, he challenged Mikhail Gorbachev to tear down the wall. And just 2 years later, they tore down the wall. So the Soviet Union was on the verge of collapse, and they had no choice. And so when perestroika was announced, what they were telling people is, if you don't want to be a part of the Soviet Union anymore, we get it. Okay, we give up. They waved the white flag, and 14 different nations declared their independence against the Soviet Union in 1991. Gorbachev resigned his office, so the leader of the Soviet Union has stepped down, and these independent states began. In fact, communism, at least the Soviet brand, was breaking up. Gorbachev, after all, reduced Soviet control of these Eastern European bloc states, urging democratic reforms in those places. The Berlin Wall was torn down. There's no longer an East Germany and a West Germany. There is now a Germany. And all of these bloc states, like Czechoslovakia, the Baltic states, Hungary, Bulgaria, Romania, Poland, no longer have to be communist if they don't want to be. And Gorbachev even encouraged them to set up democratic elections. And I remember this time well. It was very hopeful. I mean, even as a little kid, we had a party with our friends to celebrate the end of the Cold War, something that had been going on my parents' entire lifetime, something that most people just assumed was the status quo. And now we can celebrate an end to the Cold War. But unfortunately, it's not that simple. History has shown that when you take a group of people that have been conquered or enslaved or ruled over, and you set them free, it can create problems. Think of the end of the American Civil War and how you had this situation of fascism going on in the southern states. And fascism came to an end with the passage of the 13th Amendment. But the dismantling of fascism in the southern states was a long, arduous, and sometimes violent process. And unfortunately, states like Yugoslavia broke up. There is no more Yugoslavia. It's broken up into many different places. So here's what the end of the Cold War looked like on a map. So all of the yellow and blue countries were once one big giant country. In fact, if you look at an old map, anything mid-1980s or older, it just shows one big giant USSR with the hammer and the sickle. Now, if you look at a map of Eastern Europe, it's even more complicated than this one, because there's lots of little states, because all of these different groups are people who didn't want to be a part of the Soviet Union anymore. They didn't want to all join together and be friends. No. The Polish people united because they considered themselves ethnically Polish. They identified as Polish because that's their history. The same with the Bulgarians. Bulgarians are ethnically Slavic. Polish are a little different. Yes, have some Slavic ethnicities, but also have different ethnicities. So they broke up along kind of historical national lines. But into China. So the Soviet Union began to break up in the late 1980s. And a group of Chinese students saw their opportunity too. They said, hey, you know what? If the Soviet Union's breaking up, maybe communism is ending worldwide. Maybe we can get democracy in our country. Maybe this is it. And honestly, as a little kid, I thought so too. I thought, yay, communism is over. G.I. Joe won, yay. But not in China. In China, massive protests of tens of thousands of people were underway all throughout the country. People who wanted democratic elections, who wanted an end to communism in China. And the focal point was in Beijing, at Tiananmen Square. The premier of communist China ordered that all of these protests be dispersed by any means necessary. And maybe you've seen this famous picture. One of my favorite pictures in all of history. Because you see, when the tanks rolled in to stop the protest, most people left. I mean, what would you do? Okay, you show up for a march. Yay, march, wave my sign. People with guns show up. What are you going to do? I don't want to be shot. I don't know. I mean, I just don't. Period. I'm out. Thanks. Bye. Great protest, guys. See you next time. Not this kid. The tanks roll into Tiananmen Square, and he stands in front of them. You know what? There's a picture of this. There's actually video of this, by the way. The tanks try to move around the kid. He's your age. He steps back in front of the column of tanks. And if you watch the video, it cuts off right then. There's only a few seconds of it, but it cuts off right after the tanks move around him. That kid's never been seen again. You know, he could have been a George Washington, but George Washington had an army. This was just a kid. And you know what? China's still communist. Sometimes you lose, but we'll always remember this kid. That's courage. Standing up for something even when you might lose, just because it's the right thing to do. And I'm pretty sure they killed him. Probably in a very horrible way. But he still stood up to what he thought was wrong.
France had a Bastille Day to remember. But even Paris's dazzling anniversary was overshadowed by memories of the terror. Not that of 2 centuries ago, but the terror of 1989. Thoughts were centered on recent events very far from the Champs-Élysées. For a few weeks in spring, the Young Guard had held sway in the heart of Beijing. The students demanded a new style of government. In the end, that is what happened. On a night in May, Tiananmen Square became a killing ground. Bodies were broken, hopes were destroyed. The People's Army had moved against the people and crushed all they inspired. One man made a stand for freedom. Even tanks are daunted by such courage. But still the gunfire continued, random and deadly. Those responsible showed no remorse and no mercy. It was left to others to mourn. Fear ruled the streets. Dissent was a capital offense. In just 7 days, the face of modern China was changed forever.
Now, the end of the Soviet Union had worldwide effects. For example, in Nicaragua, there was a group rebelling against communism there. Honestly, there were hundreds of different countries that had fallen to communism at the end of the Second World War. And after the Soviet Union fell, there were hundreds of movements around the world of people who thought, we can put an end to this in our place. In Nicaragua, for example, this rebel group had taken over. And this was going on even throughout the 1970s, before Reagan's time, before the end of the Soviet Union. And Jimmy Carter had been sending them aid. They were a group called the Sandinistas. They were rebelling against communism in Nicaragua. Until Reagan. Reagan actually called this rebel group communist. He said, actually, they're the bad guys rebelling against the established government of Nicaragua. Now, Carter had been sending them aid because he felt that the government of Nicaragua was corrupt and doing bad things to their people, and so he wanted to support the rebels. But Reagan called them communist and instead helped the opposition, a group called the Contras. Now, the Contras, with the help of Ronald Reagan in 1990, seized power. The Sandinistas lost. And we'll come back to that in just a moment, because some very sketchy things happened that the United States had done to help the Contras win. Meanwhile, in Grenada in 1983, the very same year that Reagan gave the speech that I showed you at the beginning about calling the Soviet Union an evil empire, President Reagan sent troops to oust the communist government in Grenada, a tiny little island in the Caribbean, and replaced them with a government loyal to the United States. In Panama, meanwhile, you may remember that Jimmy Carter made a deal with the Panamanians that in 1999 that the canal would belong to them. But then in the 1990s, Panama was ruled by a dictator, Manuel Antonio Noriega. And this dictator was running his entire country like the mob. The entire country of Panama ran by this dictator, Noriega. Their chief export was cocaine to the United States. And so the United States sent troops to arrest this dictator, and he was sentenced to 40 years for drug trafficking. Okay, yeah, he's leader of a sovereign state, but in the war on drugs, that's not how things worked. So here's Noriega. Different leader. This is Qaddafi, who was the dictator of Libya. He actually seized power in 1969. And so this is a little more recent. But Qaddafi was overthrown by his people in a popular uprising in 2011. This was called the Arab Spring. This is another one of those hopeful moments where people were rising up against leaders that they saw as fascist. And what did they do with this man? Well, this is 2011. They drug him out of his palace, and they stabbed him to death in a mob of people. Now, back to the Contras. So Nicaragua put down the rebellion of the Sandinistas with the help of the United States. But a lot of this was done in secret. Meanwhile, in 1983, terrorists loyal to Iran took Americans hostage in Lebanon. Reagan said that he would not negotiate with terrorists. If you've ever heard that phrase, Reagan was the first to really say that over and over again. The United States does not negotiate with terrorists, period. And what did he do in secret? He negotiated with terrorists. In fact, what did he do? Well, he sold the Iranians weapons. And he took the money from the sales and he gave that money to the Contras. And this was called the Iran-Contra Scandal. It's really sketchy. It's very illegal. And it's definitely some covert stuff. Several of his staff members were indicted. And after Reagan retired, after his second term, Bush pardoned all of them. Yeah, so again, some sketchy stuff.
At the beginning of the year, Iran celebrated the 7th anniversary of the revolution by the Ayatollah Khomeini. It still appeared to Western eyes the most dangerous nation in the Middle East, preaching the most militant form of the Muslim religion. Iran was not a country you had any dealings with if you could avoid it, but it became public in autumn of 1986 that both French and Americans had privately decided that you could not avoid it in dealing with the Iranians because Iranians had influence over their religious supporters in Lebanon, and those religious supporters held both French and American hostages. In their messages, the captives contrasted their plight with the efforts to get Nicholas Danilov out of Russia with the apparent lack of effort to save them. The official American position was that it refused to negotiate with terrorists, but unofficially it had negotiated. This was confirmed publicly by the Iranians. American officials secretly visited Tehran and offered the Iranians weapons in return for the release of their hostages. It was also revealed that the Israelis had acted as middlemen in the dealings. The hostages were released. But President Reagan paid a high political price for their freedom. It was soon discovered that the weapons money paid by Iran was given to Contra rebels who Mr. Reagan supported in Nicaragua. So America broke 3 of its own rules. They had negotiated with terrorists, secretly sold arms to Iran, and given money to the Contras. It was not clear just how much President Reagan knew of these activities on his behalf. One of his top advisors resigned. Mr. Reagan's popularity sank. Meanwhile, Iran's war with Iraq, one reason why Iran needed American weapons, ended its 6th year this September. The war has killed about 200,000 people thus far.
In the early 1990s, as the Iran-Iraq war was over, the nation of Iraq was deeply in debt. And in order to help pay this debt, Saddam Hussein decided to invade a tiny neighboring country called Kuwait. It's tiny. I mean, it's maybe half of Western Carolina. But that tiny little country contained a large chunk of the world's oil. And so he was going to invade. He was going to occupy these oil fields. He was going to sell this oil to help pay off the war debt. But not so fast. The United States got involved. In Operation Desert Storm, a coalition of many different countries, an army made up mostly of the United States, but also many different nations, invaded the country of Iraq and liberated Kuwait from Iraqi rule. It was a very short war. The air fighting, I believe, lasted about 2 weeks, ground fighting about 3 days, and the war was over quickly. It was celebrated as a great American victory, and Kuwait was liberated.
When more than words finally began to be exchanged in the Gulf, there was an ironic sense of relief for many of the alliance troops there. The waiting was over. the fighting had begun. In the first days and the following weeks, the alliance launched a series of air attacks inside Iraq and occupied Kuwait. Although some were in civilian areas, the alliance said its bombing was selective and specific. The initial excitement of pilots saying they were receiving little or no opposition in the skies was tempered as the first report of aircraft losses came in. The realities of war were beginning to be felt. Despite the sophistication of their technology, the media of necessity had to rely on the military authorities for any coverage of the attacks that were taking place. Much was being made of the Scud missiles being held by Iraq, able to be moved around to different launch sites. They proved difficult to track down and a serious threat, especially to Israel. There were fears that the Jewish state would respond to any Iraqi attack by joining the conflict, thus threatening the Arab Western Alliance. However, with the supply of U.S.-made Patriot missiles and some diplomatic pressure, Israel was persuaded not to respond when the attacks eventually came. Saudi Arabia came under Scud attack too. And it was clear, even with Patriot protection, a disabled Scud was not a safe one.
Got a live hit on the air. Great, guys.
Some did die in these attacks, and damage was caused as this one on Saudi Arabia. But ironically, it was to be in the last days of the war that a Scud claimed the lives of 28 American Marines. While appearing to stand little chance in the military conflict, Iraq was to take the initiative in the propaganda war. When United States aircraft attacked Baghdad in February, they bombed what they said was a military command bunker. The Baghdad authorities said the building was an air raid shelter. More than 200 people died and many more were injured. This created strains within the coalition. The first real ground exchanges in the war came in the battle for the Saudi border town of Hachi. Iraqi troops moved into the town and held it for a day before the alliance regained control after fierce fighting. It appeared Saddam's aim had been to provoke a full-scale coalition response, but the real land battle was yet to come. A huge oil slick appeared in the Gulf. Washington said that the Iraqis were deliberately pumping oil into the water. Baghdad said, however, that it is coming from oil pumping stations and tankers damaged in the airstrikes. Tension was rising perceptibly in the Gulf until on February 24th, the long-awaited coalition ground offensive began. The fight would be short, but horrific. Alliance casualties would be low, but the exact number of Iraqis and Kuwaitis killed during Iraq's occupation would never be known.
So estimates are that during the Iraq War, as many as several 100,000 Iraqis died at the hands of the U.S. coalition. So domestically, George H.W. Bush was hurt by a rising deficit and recession. He was forced to break his campaign promise of rising taxes. His approval ratings dropped, and it's going to lead to him not being reelected. And we'll talk more about that later.